Ted, I gotta say, you didn't pull any punches inside that room. You just looked at that group out there and you said, hey, if you think this treaty is gonna do what you say it's gonna do, which is put an end to terrorism, control the illegal arms trade, and stop human rights abuses, you're kidding yourselves.
Well, the way I like to think about the arms trade treaty is it's like Congress passing a law to outlaw crime. If it was that simple, the problem would have been solved already. Almost every nation in that room, with the exception of a few democracies, are responsible for human rights abuses, for tyranny, for autocracy, for shipping weapons illegally to terrorists, for supporting rebel groups around the world. The idea that they're going to sign a treaty that will actually stop them from doing these things is, as I said in that room, a fantasy.
All the NGOs sitting up there, others speaking, NRA's Wayne LaPierre spoke. Did you get a chance to look out and see how any of the countries and the delegates were reacting?
I did, just very briefly. And I think the overwhelming attitude in the room was frankly one of resentment compounded with a little bit of fear, really. Most of the countries do not like the people who are skeptical about the treaty being given a chance to speak. The UN is really a place where only the people who are basically willing to toe the party line are given a lot of floor time. The UN is much more comfortable with the treaty advocates who spoke after the people who are skeptical about the treaty. So out there in the room, I just saw dislike, fear, loathing, regret that we were speaking, and frankly, I hope that we'd finish as fast as possible.
And I'm sure they didn't like the fact that you pointed out, everybody says, hey, you know what, the UN embargoes, they don't do anything. That's why we need this treaty. I'm sure they didn't appreciate that.
Well, to me, this is one of the biggest ironies of the entire treaty. You have a country like Kenya, and Kenya is one of the ATT's leading proponents. They have been at the front of this charge for years. Everyone also in that room knows that Kenya is responsible for shipping large amounts of weapons illegally to South Sudan. So they are at one time the biggest campaigner for the treaty, and they're one of the biggest violators of the treaty. Now, I think what they're doing as far as South Sudan goes makes a lot of sense from a national interest point of view. But if I did that from a national interest point of view, I wouldn't go off and say I wanted the treaty to stop myself from doing it.
And I thought it was very interesting how you said to them, hey, you're looking for solutions? Look in the mirror. Look to your own delegates and states that are sitting in this room.
Yeah, if the nations of the world want to raise their standards on the import and the export of arms, they're completely free to do so. The U.S. has very high standards. If every country in that room wants to adopt American standards, I think that would be a huge step forward. They are perfectly free to do so. If they're so enthusiastic about doing it, why don't they just get along and do it instead of negotiating a treaty?
And they keep talking about, quote unquote, a broad and robust treaty. Broad and robust to only benefit the governments that are sitting in that room. We're not talking about helping the law-abiding citizens that are being assaulted and murdered every single day in some of these countries.
What you hear every day in that conference room is the idea that standards for the arms trade treaty have to be objective. And objective is one of these wonderful UN words. When it's used by countries like Cuba and Syria and Iran, what objective means is a treaty that will never affect me in any way whatsoever. So when you hear robust or comprehensive or objective, you can't look at the dictionary to figure out what these words mean. You have to consult the UN dictionary. That's a totally separate dictionary.
Well, how about the U.S. saying that when it comes to our Second Amendment freedoms and our right to own a firearm, we will not allow them to be handicapped in any way? Is that a UN word, or is that the word? I mean, what does that mean?
I read this U.S. statement about not handicapping the Second Amendment, and I thought it was kind of a joke. What does handicap mean?
Yeah.
That's in this context, that's a completely meaningless statement. The fundamental problem I have with all of these U.S. government statements is they always say, we support the Second Amendment. Great. What exactly does that mean? Simply saying you support the Second Amendment is no substitute at all for being specific about the kind of actions and the kind of freedoms you plan to defend.
But what you don't hear from the U.S. government is put it in writing. Define what a small arm is. Make clear, but they won't do it. They don't draw the line in the sand like John Bolton did years ago. They don't even come close to that.
No, one of my colleagues who spoke against the treaty today made the very important point. If you want to exclude civilian firearms from this treaty, it's very simple to do so. Simply say that the treaty, in its scope, does not cover firearms that are legally owned inside a particular country. Very simple to do. The reason countries don't want to do this is because no other country in the world has anything like the Second Amendment, and a lot of them are very afraid of the idea that the Second Amendment represents.
So from what you've seen so far at this conference, what's your message to gun owners about their concerns and why they better keep a close eye on what's going on here?
I got two messages. First of all, keep a close eye on the United Nations, not just on the Arms Trade Treaty, but on the entire UN gun control, gun registration process. It's bigger than the ATT. But second, don't mistake panicking about the ATT right now for paying attention over the long run, because the UN works by taking slices. It's a slice here, a slice there, and a slice tomorrow. Don't focus on right now and forget about what's going to happen next week, next month, next year.
And you mentioned registration, another big point here for the UN. That's what they want to do. They want to set up an international registry.
Yeah, one of the biggest threats that I see potentially coming out of an arms trade treaty is that you will begin to get the kernel of an international gun registry scheme. What the ATT is likely to do is say that any guns that are imported would have to be registered. That certainly wouldn't affect the majority of guns in the United States, but it would affect some. You could then see how that might be built off of in the years to come and in treaties to come. It's an unwise step. It's a step that a lot of dictatorial regimes and autocracies around the world would love to take, but it doesn't fit us or fit our rights at all here in the United States.
And you got to ask, so why then has President Obama signed on in support of this? It's obvious he thinks the UN should have more say in what goes on in America.
I think a lot of people who are in favor of this treaty are well-intentioned, but I think they are deeply, deeply naive, and some of them are profoundly hostile to the Second Amendment and to the idea of private firearms ownership in any country in the world, including the United States.
But what about the fact that the UN should have more say over what we do in America? I mean, that's what's going on in that room.
What we're going to get out of this, as you said at the opening, is a treaty that is going to be ineffective on the international scale, and a treaty that is going to have incalculable domestic consequences, incalculable part because we don't have a treaty text yet, but incalculable also in part because there are people in the administration, there are unfortunately judges in this country who believe that international law or transnational law or treaties should play a much bigger role in affecting how we interpret the Constitution. Very dangerous.
And that should be a concern of every American, not just gun owners. We're talking about individual rights and freedoms.
These are people who are not just concerned about the Second Amendment and changing its interpretation. They want to change the interpretation of the First Amendment as well. This is a constitutional liberty concern. It doesn't simply matter only to firearms owners.